here you can get millisecond resolution, but you will not get the spatial resolution. You will not get such fine detailed images of the brain, right? You are only getting the electrical activity. So there is a compromise. Either get a better temporal resolution or get a better spatial resolution. So what you do in that case is, again, you can do simple interpolation. This is known as slice timing correction. You do interpolation to get the brain images aligned as if they were taken in one single snapshot, not as if they were done one after the other. There's also a possibility that instead of an ascending sequence, right, from bottom of the brain to the top of the brain, what you do is you take it in two goes, right? Right, top to bottom, but leave one out, and again top to bottom, leave one out, right? So you take odd number slices and even number slices. So that is also good idea, right? Don't go only like from one end to the other end. We've already talked about spatial normalization. Different people are having different brains. So it is not about intelligence, but it's about just the shape. So you have to have a warping or a nonlinear transformation. And finally, we do some sort of smoothing because there are a lot of image processing steps involved. And then what you do is a regression. As I said, what this regression model does, or a general linear model does, is simply says when was the task and when was the baseline period, so that I can find the task activity and subtract it from the baseline period. So it's like y is equal to beta are the parameters of regression that you want to estimate. Y is nothing but the brain images that you have collected, the intensity of the brain images, and we are doing it voxel by voxel. This is known as massive univariate analysis. X is your experimental setup, the design matrix, and this is the constant term. We all know that whenever you do regression, we need to include the constant term so that you can get a good fit. And we can like compare and contrast, like let's say last 4 sessions compared to the first 4 sessions of my task. I am trying to contrast, and I get this activation map. This is a glass brain. A glass brain again is x, y, y, z, zx projections because it's 3-dimensional data, or you can show it on the brain slices, right? So this is the activity. These are the different regions of the brain that are active when doing the task. Or you can also project back into the 3-dimensional space rather than the 2-dimensional space. This is the surface of it. So any questions so far?
No, sir. If anyone have question, they can ask.
So finding brain activity, which part of the brain is active during a task, is very interesting. Okay, fine, good. But it's not like only one part of our brain is doing one task, right? As I have shown you, there are multiple regions of the brain that are doing the task. Now you want to know what is the connections between them. So from the last 10 to 15 years, there is this huge project like the Human Connectome project. It's like the Human Genome Project that gave rise to the bioinformatics revolution. And we have the neuroinformatics as a field that has emerged. And we can see that what are the connections between the different brain areas, right? Okay, so for example, the visual cortex, there are different regions in the visual cortex, let's say V1 and V5, and you want to see how attention is modulating the connection between them. So what we try to do is you have two different types of models. One, that there is a link between source and target, and there is something that is modulating it, or the stimuli and target is activating, but there is the source is now the modulator. So what we try to identify is the interaction effects between different brain regions. We do this using what is known as psychophysiological interaction. So it is like this, that let's say I take one seed voxel in the brain and I want to see the correlation of this seed voxel with the rest of the brain. Okay. Next, I will take another voxel in the brain and I will try to find the correlation with the rest of the voxels in the brain. Like that, if I am doing, then the number of analysis I have to do, because we are talking about three-dimensional brain images and at a very fine resolution, right? The resolution can be as good as 2 millimeter by 2 millimeter by 2 millimeter, right? So it's like you're actually pinpointing a very small portion of the brain. Even in that small region, there are 10,000 neurons. Now that is another problem altogether. But we are able to get to a lot of like of the order of like 1 lakh voxels, 10 lakh voxels. That is the number of data you have. And this is quite huge. And so what we do is we define one region of interest, like, let's say primary visual cortex, and just find the average activity in that and see, like here is the average activity in the primary visual cortex. And you look at the rest of the brain and see whoever is changing the correlation, right? So the correlation was high during attention, but it is less during the no attention. So attention and no attention is the task that you are giving to people, right? So that is your job. From the analysis point of view, what we are trying to see, where is that correlation changing, right? Which parts of the brain have a significant change in the correlation. So this is known as psychophysiological interaction. Now, very well, so there are so many MRI studies, neuroscientists are all studying the brain. So the functional MRI can be used to identify the brain function. Very good, but the point is there are 30,000, 40,000 studies coming out. And what did we learn from it? All right. So that is challenging because, as I said, understanding the brain function, there's no one-to-one mapping, right? So it is not possible. You cannot say like caudate nucleus is only involved in language. You can't say that the basal ganglia is only involved in movement. That is just a broad function. All right. You can say primary visual cortex is involved in vision. Fine. But there's a lot more that the brain areas do, and it's very difficult to map directly. So you can do what is known as meta-analysis. What is meta-analysis? You take all these different studies, you put together the results of all of them, right? Because we are all using the same template. So when you use the same template, what happens is that we can all report in the same coordinate space. So the center of the brain is XYZ is 0, right? 0, 0, 0. So that is all fixed. And the peak activity location I am reporting in the papers that I have published. So it's very easy. You can like combine all those results and like you can plot and see if there is a converging evidence or not, right? So that is a very useful way of doing it. There is even a better approach known as the big data approach. So this is a large scale automated synthesis of brain imaging data. This has already been there about 8 years ago. And what they did, they take a term like pain. You find all related studies. And as I said, you have the coordinates XYZ being reported. You put it together and you do the meta-analysis. This is what I described. So that tells every study which was related to pain, the activity was most commonly found in this sort of regions. That is known as the forward inference. Now the question is, if I know the brain activity, can I infer whether it was more related?
Sir, please unmute your mic. Your mic is muted. Krishna sir, please unmute your mic. Your mic is muted.
Okay, so from where do I repeat?
Yeah, this slide, sir.
Yeah.
Right, sir. Right, sir.
So reverse engineering can't be inferred from the brain that you asked, sir.
Yeah, so we use the brain Bayesian inference, right? So the conditional probability of pain given the activation is what you want to infer, right? And what you do, simply apply the Bayes rule and you say what is the maximum probability, and you can say, okay, if you give a brain image and you want to infer, this is like brain reading, right? It's very interesting. There are very good applications of this. So for example, I can have these voxels. This is known as multi-voxel pattern analysis or machine learning based approaches where we are doing brain reading. So if you have a set of voxels and then there is an object that you are seeing like a face or some house, some tools or other objects, you want to distinguish them. What you do is you do this multi-voxel analysis, right? You train a machine learning classifier by some examples and you give a new test image and you say, okay, what was it that the person was seeing? So that's a very interesting one. And there is a practical application of this as well. Like, for example, this is a patient. This patient was in vegetative state. Vegetative state is like coma. So the person is brain dead as per clinical testing. Now we want to assess whether this person is actually brain dead or not. The person is not responding. We had this Munna by MBBS movie where the person was not at all responding and the patient was not responding. But this was a 2005 study in University of Cambridge. This is not from my group, but a neighboring lab. So where they looked at this patient, asked her to imagine walking in a room or playing badminton. Both are movement related things, but the brain activity is supposedly different, as you see in this picture here. Okay, and the pattern actually matches that of a healthy individual. Now this person in coma cannot tell us whether they are listening to us or not. That is why we say they are not responding or brain dead. But actually this person was listening. Their brain activity was exactly like a healthy normal, because a healthy normal person will tell you, okay, fine, I understand what you're telling me, right? And that is one good way to see why brain reading might be helpful in clinical cases. This is one case study I wanted to like show you as an illustration. So here what happens is this is one of the very fundamental principles called associative learning or Pavlovian conditioning. So it's like, whenever, like, let's say you like lemon pickle and you see that the aroma of that already makes you mouth watering, right? So that is exactly the situation here, that when you are predicting a good taste, what happens is that there is some sort of a response that you are expecting a good taste, right? It could be with for a pizza or something like that. And the brain area that corresponds to this is this midbrain dopamine neurons. Again, this is something very well known in popular science. Dopamine is your pleasure center of the brain. And what it does is exactly like, if the bell was predicting a piece of meat to the dog, right? The dopamine neurons will activate to the bell, right? That is how it works. This is known as associative learning. You're learning the association between a neutral stimulus like the sound to something that is biologically significant to you, like food, right? And what we did this kind of meta-analysis to different uh, uh, fMRI studies. And what we found is a very good consistency across different methods. This is known as activation likelihood estimation. I didn't go into the details of these algorithms, multi-kernel analysis, or this neurosynth analysis. What I would do is quickly run you through the neurosynth database. You can see my browser, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
So there is a web interface available. This is the paper of big data, the very first research group that has used this. And you can, this is also a result of the reward studies. Every time it picks a different term, okay? And you can see which part of the brain are activated to rewards, right? You can go to the terms and like, let's say I can say emotion. Okay, emotion I select. So I get the brain areas related to emotion. The maximum activity it is showing here is actually amygdala, and that is quite correct. It's known that emotion is activated by amygdala. I can go and try something called memory. Okay, and the result is shown to us here. And what it is showing here, this region is the memory area, the hippocampus. So this is a very useful way to do a number of analysis. There is also topic modeling. I will not be discussing all of that today, but you can get the code and it's open source. Python code is available. All the procedures are described, and this is very interesting for you to explore, right? This is like having a laboratory in your computer, right? You don't have to actually run the studies. All the study data is there. So these are the different brain areas, and the number of voxels we found using different techniques is listed out here, different brain regions and so on. So what we did, we created our own data set also from the abstracts rather than from the full text of articles. So PubMed is the abstract for biomedical papers. I think someone needs to mute their mic.
तुम्हारे पास कहाँ है? मेरे पास सारे ये
Done, sir.
Sir, your mic got muted, I think.
Is this okay now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Please.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So we did our own PubMed uh, research. We extracted the abstracts and a very interesting problem of different domains of decision making we have picked up. So perceptual decision making is like categorization of objects. Is this a scissor or a mug? Then that's like a categorization. It's a perceptual decision, right? Value-based decision is like, what do you prefer? It's not like asking, is this orange or the apple, right? That is a perceptual decision making. Value-based decision making is, what do you prefer? Do you like an apple or do you like a orange? Right? That's a value-based decision. Or social decision making is where you have other agents involved, right? Will you buy a lottery ticket? Right? If there is some amount of money, do you want to donate any part of that money? So any game theory sort of things are all included in this social decision making, right? So these are all, as you see, are very, very different type of tasks, but they are all related to decision making. So if you are doing an experiment, you are only doing an experiment in any one of the domain. It's not possible for you to do an experiment which combines all the domains. So obviously that is a good candidate for us to identify a good reason to do meta-analysis, right? So we identified different number of studies and we filtered them, and you do this meta-analysis. Okay, well and good, right? So there is some overlap, but not a full overlap of the different types of decision making. So what you see is that the value-based and social decision making were a lot more similar compared to the perceptual decisions. And the perceptual decision, there was some extra activity in more the parietal areas which were related to visual information processing and things like that. But there was some commonality as well. So that was the idea behind doing it. Next step, what we did is we took our database and we identified all the key concepts. All right. Key concept means anything that is like attention, learning, memory, anything which is not a common word, right? So these are all key concepts in the papers. And you identify for each key concept. There are like 500 key concepts that we looked at. For each key concept, you identify which is the other concept that is closely related to it. How do you do that? You have to find the distance. You need a distance metric, right? Normally you can take Euclidean distance or any such metric. Okay, we use this Jaccard metric. What is Jaccard metric? When you have lot of zeros, then the Jaccard metric is only going to look at the non-zero distances. That is what is a Jaccard distance metric. And you do hierarchical clustering. We construct a dendrogram, and what we are trying to do is we try to cluster them. So it's like if we are creating a graph, the nodes are the key concepts, and and an edge is drawn to the closest concept. So we try to identify the different key concepts, who was related to whom. So actions and action was related. Olfactory and taste were related. Okay. Skin and heart were related because you measure skin conductance in people, and also heart rate variability. These are physiological measures that, yeah, positive and negative related, right? So usually people are having research studies which look at both positive and negative. And when I look at three concepts that are clustered together, happy, angry, fearful, all emotions are being clustered together. There is also like placebo, non-painful, and somatotopic. These are also linked together. So I'll give you a few more examples like that. So this is a graph that we constructed with 17 nodes. And you see painful, perceived, perception, discrimination, right? Perceptual discrimination, right? Unpleasantness, nociceptive simulation. These are all like related to each other. The next step, as I said, like having constructed that kind of hierarchical dendrograms, right? What do you do with that? We are trying to identify the network of brain areas. Okay, I'll tell you. The activations are all like single dots. Okay, there are all these single dots. You smooth those images. Okay, you smooth those images, a dot will become like a Gaussian blur, right? So instead of a single dot, you have some activity around that region. You take a small Gaussian activity and you take all those kind of images and do independent component analysis on them. What independent component analysis will try to do is it tries to decompose the data. It's like orthogonally, like principal component analysis you might have heard as well. It is projecting the data on the different dimensions to see which are not correlated with one another. That's what we call as independent component analysis. And this data you can visualize in terms of a correlogram. Again, this is an algorithm that is used in bioinformatics. This is like not each dimension, right? The hierarchical clustering. So the like at the leaf node is each concept, let's say. Okay, just for explanation, I'm telling you the concepts are here. This is very dense graph, so I am showing you on the IC the independent components, how they are clustered together. So the closest ones will be clustered as the smallest one, and as you then are merged into one. Then they go into the next level and so on, like that. So the same thing is here, but this is 500 leaf nodes, so it's very dense. That's why it's all looking black for us. Okay, so how am I doing with time? I would like to take some questions here. I don't want to have a monologue. I mean, is this something of interest? If there are.
Yes, so I have a question.
Yeah.
So you were telling about the two-class or multi-class prediction or classification analysis.
Yes.
I am working with the ECG features and
Which
looking to
features?
work with the ECG.
ECG, yeah.
Yes. So I'm looking to go for three class classification accuracy analysis.
Yeah.
So I implemented here the support vector machine for the same. But when I'm seeing the hyperplane which is shown, giving me a very less prediction accuracy.
Right.
But the same thing when I'm implementing in two class, I'm getting a pretty high accuracy.
Yes.
So how can I improve my model to improve the accuracy in three class model?
So that is more related to what type of kernel you are using. Is it linear or non-linear?
Okay. So I'm using here the linear quadratic kernel.
You can use a radial basis function, one. And second is when you are doing multi-class classification, it obviously also tells that the data is not separable. Right? And that's the
Right.
reason you're so usually that is dealt as multiple two class classifications are being done. Okay, so that's lot more simplistic view of looking at the classification problem. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Sir, I also have one question. Am I audible?
Yeah. Yes. Sorry about this noise. There's a lot of construction.
Sir, we have more focused on the fMRI. I have a question regarding the structural MRI. So if we take the example of 1 images of the MRI, structural MRI, how we can identify the condition on which the MRI image. Like for example, if we are considering Alzheimer's disease, epilepsy, how can we differentiate different regions which are affected with the help of MRI, structural MRI?
So I will be covering that aspect in a lecture tomorrow.
Okay, okay, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you. If anyone have any question, may ask or sir will proceed further.
Hello.
Yes.
So yes, I have a one basic question. We were
Yeah.
talking about task and rest fMRI
Yeah.
data.
Yeah.
So I would like to have your view on network neuroscience.
So network neuroscience is very, very useful because as I said, the brain doesn't work in as different parts of the brain specialized for different functions. So that specialization is at only a broad level, but the rest of it is all network, right? So the
Right.
information is in the network. It is not in the individual brain regions. And there is also a very useful property known as plasticity. Like, you know, if you have a blind person, what happens to their visual cortex? It is taken by the auditory cortex or their somatosensory cortex. So they have a superior touch or a superior voice quality, right? So many people become musicians who are blind, right? Congenitally blind. So what happens is the brain function is reorganized. So networks are the key. Okay, we can do functionals. I didn't go again into the details, right? Again, because it's like it's my research area. I don't know how much of it is you are interested, right? So network neuroscience is making a distinction between functional segregation and functional integration. Segregation is like a modular approach. You're saying this part of the brain does this part of the brain does that. And in functional integration, what we are saying is it's a connection between, let's say, frontal and parietal lobe that is involved in more complex task. If you say something like that, then you try to make this kind of graphs. You find the edges between the different nodes, right? So each node of the graph is like one brain area. You find the edges, you find the weight, how strong is the connection between them, and you try to interpret not only like one or two regions, but across several multiple, like almost of the order of 100 regions in the brain. And that's also very relevant to what Professor Utkarsh was asking, that in structural MRI, how can I distinguish? So if you have a schizophrenia patient, what happens? Right? So their
Right.
brain network will be different from the normal person. Or if you have a child with autism, right? There is a difference in the network connectivity, and that is giving them a different characteristics. So that's a very good and rich area to explore further. And I also mentioned the Connectome project. That's also completely network neuroscience.
Right. So we talk about the small world architecture, right?
Correct. Brain does a wonderful, compliance to the small world networks. So there are what are known as default mode network, attention network, emotion network. You can very nice, and it's like the results are clear that okay, if I am doing a task, the default mode network shouldn't be active.
Right.
If I am not doing any task, the default mode network will be active. I am relaxing, I am doing meditation, more activity in default mode network. Right? These are all small world networks, very well defined regions of the brain. And one interesting thing, I didn't discuss it, but if you see, the brain is operating like a computer, right? Ones and zeros, because the neuron will fire or not fire. So where is the code in the brain? It is in the frequency. The code is not like more activity, less activity. In that case, then, our brain should burst out, right? If you have a lot of stimulation, like loud noise, or, you go into a concert and there's a lot of music being played, then if the brain is acting linearly, then our brain should basically burst out. That's not what happens. So the code is in the frequency. So so initially we wanted some method to study brain. So we looked at this fMRI. Now we say, okay, that is not a complete theory of the brain function. If you want a complete theory, what you do? You go and look at the networks, right? So in fact, we did a study as well by applying network identification techniques in EEG data, right? In our lab, we have EEG facility here. So you can look at complex networks is the international conference. We have published a paper on that. What we did is we showed movie trailers like Tare Zameen Par or Three Idiots, right? And a small clip, not. So in the Three Idiots, we had this joke where the foreigner gives a speech in Hindi. Okay, Tare Zameen Par is one of these emotional scenes where the child is being scolded by the parents or something like that. So you have different emotions. We call it Navarasa from Indian movie language or Indian dance forms. We call it Navarasas. And we've looked at the network similarity and differences from a network neuroscience point of view. So please refer to that paper.
Thank you.
Complex networks is the name of the
Sir, sir,
yes.
sir,
Yeah.
am I audible?
Yes, please.
Sir, I have one question. Actually, I have worked with EEG, PCG, and ECG, but
Yeah.
not MRI. So, can I use MRI for detect different type of, if I want to detect epileptic seizure or others? So, what type of network for data after data acquisition it will be suitable for me, because I don't have any idea about that MRI. I did not work anything regarding on MRI.
So
So,
with
can you?
MRI,
idea.
the point is you can localize the region of the brain. Okay. So what the doctors typically do is they try to identify the source in epilepsy. That is the most important thing. If you want to avoid seizures, you have to do surgery and remove that part of the brain that is causing the seizures. So the monitoring in epilepsy is done using EEG. That's how you do it, right? I mean, you can get simultaneously other physiological measures like ECG and all. So
Okay, sir.
EEG is the main source. Now, when you get the EEG, that tells you what time point the seizure occurred. And at that time point, if you have an MRI, you can see which part of the brain was active, and what doctors will do further is before the surgery, they are going to make the patient do some set of tasks like a language task, finger gripping task. You know, finger gripping, just do this. So just like clench your fist and things like that. Simple tasks. So that when they do an operation, you shouldn't unknowingly impair another function of the brain. Because the brain, as I said, is very tightly packed inside the skull, and these regions are adjacent to one another, and there is no one-to-one map. So if you are removing a region of the brain, then you have to be very careful on if you are going to affect any other cognitive function. So
Okay,
MRI
sir.
is not used for a network diagnosis. It's used for the surgical purposes.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
There is somebody having their hand raised. I mean, any other questions?
Dr. Muhammad Ali, if you have any question, you can ask now.
Yeah, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Sir, in case of multi-voxel analysis, you have shown a one image. In the x-axis, there were so many voxel. In the y-axis, you were writing the stimuli. So what kind
Yeah.
of we are using various kind of neurofeedback with respect to we are keeping all voxel in a one row itself. It is like that?
So this is the typical machine learning approach where machine learning is only concerned about the feature vectors, right? It doesn't have the domain knowledge. For it, everything is simply the feature vector only, right? So you basically consider as one dimension, two dimensions, but the problem is the high dimensionality of the data. So we can't take all the voxels of the brain like that. So we will only take some region of interest, and from that only we will do. So in this case, for identifying the different categories of objects that the person is viewing, what we do is we take from the inferior temporal cortex. From that region, you take these voxels, right? So the region of interest is known by the domain expert. So you could ask me any other questions as well. I don't want to keep it a monologue, as I said. Because if there is some interest that you want to explore a research direction in this, it will because a lot of data is available now online, like the one of the tools I have shown you, and a very rich approach both from neuroscience point of view as well as from the computational point of view.
Sir, how we can join the study related to magnetic encephalogram and fMRI?
So if you no, so MEG is very rarely used. It's only used in research facilities. And MRI facility is available in every city. But fMRI, what they do is a very simple task, like as I said, like, finger clenching and language task, reading out words and things like that. So they don't do any complicated tasks. We need to do fMRI only when it is necessary. In India, I think it's better to start working with the structural MRI first, because that is available in all cities and like many private places are there. And from there we can like try to identify a certain population of target, and from there you can go ahead. But if you are interested in brain computer interfaces and things like that, then you can do this EEG based devices. There are also again commercial devices available for that.
And sir, how much a difference between the fMRI physical resolution and MRI original resolution?
Huge. In fMRI, you have like 2 seconds worth of data. In structural MRI, you have 6 minutes worth of data. So it's huge. I mean, you can't see, basically it's like a blurred photograph, right? You can't see in fMRI, you can't see the different regions of the brain distinctly. So what we do is we do a step called segmentation and co-registration. So because fMRI is low resolution, you also take one high resolution. Only one is required. You don't need many. Take one high resolution image of that person, and you co-register your low resolution image to the high resolution image of that person. All your calculations for normalization, everything we calculate using the high resolution image, right? And then that is projected onto the functional MRI data. So you never deal with functional MRI data alone. You always use one high dimensional structural MRI image, and that is what you will use as a reference.
But in case of correlation, the high dimension, no, I should say the interpolation will required, because see, if you will see the 1 pixel of fMRI, that will be 3 mm by 3 mm by 3 mm, and that
Yes.
voxel we have to represent with respect to 1 mm by 1 mm by 1 mm.
So you are interpolating,
how we will be
like
yes.
3 3s are 9, 3s are 27 times, right? So the resolution that you are trying to get is much higher by interpolation. That is where this high resolution image will come in handy. So if you do that segmentation and co-registration, so what people also do is this. So you segment into what is known as gray matter, white matter. So gray matter is the body of the neurons, white matter is the axons of the neurons, right? So the connections. And you use that gray matter, which is that cortical sheet I've said. You use that to calculate your normalization parameters. And that's how you will be able to get high resolution. Like 27 times you are increasing the resolution during the normalization. So that is possible. And that's the advantage of doing this whole process. Otherwise, we earlier had another technique called PET, the PET, positron emission tomography. That's also very low in spatial resolution as well as low in temporal resolution also. Because as I said, you give an injection and then you collect over time the radioactive decay, right? So the radioactive can travel and it makes a point on the film, right? It's like a slow X-ray, if you want to call it that way, right? The PET. So that is also a lot more slow as well as less spatial resolution. So in 6 minutes or so, you will get only one image, only one functional image. So it can't be used for any fast tracking of the task by a person. You have to do it only like the slow task.
In the one of the slides, you were showing that the impulse response and the time cycle was reaching till 15 to 20 second.
Yes,
But with respect to the how our brain is responding,
it's very
how it
fast.
will be matching with that.
So luckily the brain responses follow what is known as a linear system. Again, this is something you will all be familiar with. What is a linear system? That if I have one stimulus, I'll have one response. If I have two stimuli, I will have 1 plus 1, 2 response, right? So basically that is what is the impulse response function also. That means if I have multiple stimuli, as long as it's a linear system, right? And this needs to be verified. You can't just assume it to be a linear system. You have to verify that it is a linear system. And there are standard signal processing methods, and there is what is known as a balloon model of fMRI that has verified and proven beyond doubt that the brain works as a linear system. So you show multiple stimuli, what happens is the same hemodynamic response function, it will get added up. And you use this superposition principle, right? Like the Fourier decomposition sort of a thing, to decompose it back. That's where in that model, the regression model I mentioned, I didn't go into the details, but you convolve with this hemodynamic response function. And again, when you're doing the networks for the network neuroscience aspect, you have to deconvolve it because you're measuring the convolved signal. You have to deconvolve it before you can find the correlations. So these are the steps that you use to ensure. Another thing is also in the design of experiments is like 16 seconds, like up to 16 seconds, you have some sort of an effect after one particular stimulus. So what people used to do is a slow designs before. And then again, this fast event related design has come up because of the linear system hypothesis being confirmed. So you can what you do is you don't present its regular time intervals. You have to randomize the time intervals in which you are presenting as well as the order of the stimuli. So when you average across multiple trials, you will get the desired response faithfully. That is the idea behind how you can, use this knowledge to get a good response.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sir, am I audible?
Yeah.
Sir, I have a question regarding the stimulus. You have discussed about the various stimulus like the video and the audio sometimes, and the effect of it on the MRI. So I want to ask about the stimulus which is electrical, because in a lot of neurological diseases, sometimes it needs to be needs to give the electric stimulation or as a part of a treatment. So can we analyze our brain after giving the electrical stimulation? Like if we consider the example of a transcranial direct current stimulation, TDCS. Do you have, sir, any ideas for how we can analyze onto the MRI images? And is there any platform available so how we can do a computational analysis or modeling kind of thing?
So it's a very good question. I'm glad you are interested in these aspects. What happens typically is that when you do stimulation, you measure the change in behavior. Like you have a working memory task or a learning task or an attention task, and you can directly measure the change in behavior. When you want to also see the change in the brain, you do what is known as multimodal imaging, right? So you have TDCS or TMS coupled with fMRI, and you try to identify how are the effects in the brain, right? The actual effects due to the stimulation. This is multimodal imaging, lot more difficult than doing. So right now people have been combining EEG fMRI, TMS fMRI. Now TMS is magnetic, so you don't actually do the TMS inside the MRI scanner. What you do, you take the person to another room, you do the TMS, then you bring the person to the MRI scanner, because both are magnetic, none they conflict. Then you measure the effect of that when the person is doing like a task. So the standard fMRI you can still do. So you will have to give the some stimulus, like the visual stimuli and things like that. The electrical stimuli is also like one method of studying the brain function.
Yes, sir.
So TDCS, a lot of people try, for you treatment of depression, or for even TMS actually is clinically approved for some treatments.
Still clinically approved.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
lot is going on with that.
So people are just trying out. It's more like startup level now. It's not like already out there. Even TMS effects we don't understand completely. This is a global scenario of the neuroscience. We know a little bit, but not everything, right? It's easy. Like if you say I stimulate your motor cortex and your finger is moving, that is simple. We are talking about more cognitive functions, more disease treatments and all that. That will take time.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Sir, I want to ask, according to you, whether MRI, that is structural MRI or fMRI, is helpful in diagnosing sleeping related disorder for infants. Especially, many researchers have found out certain structural abnormality because of prematurity of the infants.
Oh, I
So,
see.
is it that MRI will be helpful during those period of time so that we can uh, do the prevalence of developing it in a regular nature, infant brains?
This is a very interesting question. I don't have answer regarding the MRI, but sleep studies, what people are doing is EEG, right? That is the polysomnography, is a very
Yes,
common
sir.
thing, right? So you attach the electrodes and let the person sleep, and
Yes.
you can identify the different stages of sleep using the EEG data. And they do this also on infants. So
Yes.
definitely
Uh,
a sleep
Sir, there
disorder
are
in
many
infants.
related disorder, like you might have heard about sudden infant death syndrome that
Yes, yes,
occurs
yes, yes. Very
suddenly,
serious. Yeah,
with
that's a very serious
infants
problem.
seemingly very normal, and suddenly with the next morning we found it dead.
Yeah. Very unfortunate. Yeah. But I mean, MRI is definitely not something that you would want to do for,
Yes.
like infants
Because of
of that
instrumental
age.
complexity, and
It
yes,
is non-invasive, but it's still a heavy magnetic field
yes,
and a lot of noise as well. There are some newer techniques coming up now, like particularly with infants, you can do functional ultrasound imaging.
yes.
See,
And
you do the,
video-based surveillance system also works,
sorry, what
like
was that?
camera system. Camera system also works for
Not the
looking the.
camera system. You can study the brain using functional ultrasound imaging. The advantage
Yes,
with infants is that their skull is not as thick as it is in adults.
yes, sir.
So ultrasound will work. Ultrasound imaging can be done for the brain also for infants. For adults, we can't do because the skull is very thick, right? You can't have any bone tissue there, right? When
Right.
you want to do ultrasound, right? So that's why abdominal ultrasound is easy. For when the baby is in the womb, you are able to do that. Similarly, after the baby is born, you can do ultrasound imaging, and that's very helpful for infant studies.
Yes. Thank you,
I mean,
sir.
this has been only last 2-3 years. ultrasound imaging being used for brain is just very, very recent.
Okay, if anyone have still a question, you can ask.
Yes, sir. I want to ask a question. Sir, I want to ask about the EEG. So, sir, in EEG, the signals that are coming is due to a dipole formation of a neuron, right? So, in that case, we can measure the radial dipole, which is directly perpendicular to the surface of the scalp. But in
Not
case
in
of
EEG. No,
no, sir.
You're reversing it. Radial dipole in MEG, tangential dipole in EEG.
Sir, what I think is we can measure radial dipole in EEG.
No. Okay. But then, yeah, go ahead. What was the question?
But sir, my question is, if we want to measure a tangential dipole, so we can measure it by MEG.
Yeah, so it's just the reverse. That's what I was telling, right?
Okay,
Deep
sir.
brain sources MEG,
Okay.
scalp tangential sources EEG.
Okay.
So people are also again trying to do combination of both. The point is we need to find a good way and what information is necessary for a particular research problem, right? Like epilepsy, for example, EEG can be monitored on continuous basis, right?
Yes,
MEG is as complicated as an fMRI because it is also like liquid cooled squids, right? The quantum magnets, the tiny magnets are your sensors, right? The squids.
yes.
So and it needs liquid helium and all that. So it's as expensive and it's only used in research facilities and not in everyday clinics. So everyday clinical use, people are still relying heavily on this. The Doppler and those things are being used for accidents and so on, because that's also becoming more important, traumatic brain injury. And another thing with the deep brain sources is this is a few years old now, that we had this problem of the inverse problem. That means we don't know which is the source when you are measuring from the scalp. Sensors are on the scalp, source is the brain. So this problem was called inverse problem, and that had been there for many years. But now what they have done is they have very good algorithms. This is known as Loretta, right? Low resolution
Yes, sir. Loretta,
electric
Loretta.
tomography, right? So what
Yes,
they
sir.
do is they say, okay, not single dipoles, but you imagine there are many dipoles. And you find all possible combinations and find the one that best gives you the topographic on the scalp. And you say these are my sources. So source localization is a solved problem now. So although the radial dipoles you can't measure in EEG, what happens is also that you can do a very good job of source localization because the brain is not a perfect sphere.
Yes, sir.
Right.
Sir, there is another method which is minimum norm estimation for EEG source localization.
MNE.
Yes, sir. So what's happened in that case? As you give information
there are
about
multiple
Loretta.
solutions. It's basically different algorithms.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Is there any question now?
So maybe we can end today's session. If there are more questions, please feel free to compile them tomorrow.
Okay, sure, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Valuable insight on
Yeah.
Thank you,
I
sir.
think
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.